Have you ever been looked at like an intruder, even when you had every right to be there? Not a casual glance, but the kind that strips you bare. You don't belong here. That night, Elijah Monroe knew that feeling better than ever. Aurora Grand, the jewel of luxury hospitality. Its grand lobby glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Women in evening gowns. Men raising champagne glasses. Gentle laughter blending with the soft hum of a piano. Everything here was designed to say, only a select few deserve to be present. And then Elijah walked in. Faded jeans, a plain polo shirt, dragging an old suitcase. No bodyguards, no flashy car. He didn't fit the picture they'd so carefully painted, or at least, that's what everyone thought. Eyes turned. The silence thickened. A few polite smirks appeared, the kind from people who think they're above you. Clarissa Bell, the hotel manager, approached. Her voice was as sweet as sugar, but every word carried a blade beneath it. Sir, I believe you'd be more comfortable at the budget hotel down the street. Elijah didn't get angry, didn't explain. He simply locked eyes with her and said, quiet enough for her to wonder what he meant, but loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. Are you sure you want to do this? In front of everyone. Clarissa smiled. The guests nodded, approving the standards she had just defended. No one knew the man they were humiliating had purchased the entire hotel chain just 72 hours ago. No one knew that in just 20 minutes. Elijah would stand in this very spot, not as an outcast, but as the owner of it all. If you've ever felt that painful silence judged, dismissed, in front of everyone, leave a comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so stories like this never stay buried. Because that night, at Aurora Grand, Elijah Monroe was humiliated like a stranger, but just 20 minutes later, everything changed. Elijah Monroe wheeled his scuffed carry-on across the cobblestone drive of the Aurora Grand. He had just landed from a transcontinental flight, body exhausted, mind sharp. He wasn't here to rest. He was here to observe. The faded gray polo and worn jeans made him look like nothing more than a mid-range traveler, maybe even a man just passing through, not the owner of an entire hotel empire. And Elijah liked it that way. The glass doors slid open, revealing the Aurora Grand's grand lobby, a space where every detail was curated to prove this was the domain of the elite. Massive crystal chandeliers spilled golden light, making the marble floor shine like 1,000 captured suns. A piano hummed softly from a distant corner, steady, cold, deliberate. Employees in charcoal uniforms stood rigid as if guarding an invisible border. Guests filled the space, mostly well-dressed white couples and a few middle-aged executives in tailored suits. They glanced at Elijah as he entered, not with curiosity, not with welcome, but with that question in their eyes. Who is he, and why is he here? A woman in a blazing red gown leaned toward her husband, whispered something about Elijah, and the two shared a quiet laugh. He recognized it immediately. He had been living with those looks since he was young, the look of people who believed they owned the room, and men like him were intruding. At the far end of the lobby, a woman approached. Clarissa Bell, manager of the Aurora Grand. 47, tall, hair in a tight bun, her face painted into an expression so controlled it was impossible to guess what she really felt. She wore a cream-colored suit, custom-tailored, likely in Paris, and walked with the authority of someone who believed she ruled this domain. She stopped in front of Elijah, lips pulling into a smile anyone else might mistake for warmth. But Elijah caught the glance, a quick, sharp scan from head to toe, the kind of look that measures and judges. "How may I help you?" "Sir," she asked. Her voice honeyed, but with a weight Elijah understood perfectly. It wasn't, "How may I help you?" It was, "What are you doing here?" He nodded slightly. not rushing his reply. In the golden glow of the chandeliers and the cold gaze of the crowd, Elijah walked forward as though stepping into a role he'd long rehearsed. He inhaled deeply, feeling the atmosphere-expensive perfume laced with the earthy richness of polished wood and manicured greenery. The scent did nothing to warm the chill of their stares. He wheeled his bag to the reception desk and stood tall, letting every pair of eyes in the room settle on him. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "I have a reservation under Monroe Group." Clarissa rested her manicured hand on the marble counter. She didn't glance at the computer, didn't type, didn't even pretend to check. Instead, she stared at Elijah, her lips curving into a thin smile that could cut. "Monroe Group," she repeated, letting the name linger like a joke she was savoring. After a deliberate pause, she tilted her head and lowered her voice. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the budget hotel down the street." The words echoed across the grand lobby. Sweet on the surface, but with a blade beneath. Elijah felt every pair of eyes on him now, as if she'd just given the entire room permission to join in humiliating him. A nearby couple smirked. A young man in a tailored suit raised an eyebrow, the half-smile of someone familiar with these unspoken games of status. These weren't laughs of joy. They were arrows, silent endorsements of Clarissa's standards. Elijah stood still. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a young black couple watching from the far side of the lobby. The woman gripped her partner's hand, sharing a familiar pain without words. Elijah understood. He'd been there before. Clarissa pressed on, playing her part for her approving audience. "We do have certain standards at the Aurora," she added, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Elijah lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were unnervingly calm. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. But something in his look made Clarissa pause just for a moment before she regained her composure. The room tightened. Guests waited for him to react, angry, embarrassed, defeated. But Elijah gave them nothing. He let the silence stretch, taut like a wire about to snap. Then he tilted his head and spoke, his voice carrying through the room. "Are you sure you want to do this? In front of everyone?" The question dropped like a stone in still water. Ripples spread. Clarissa didn't understand it, but the onlookers suddenly fell quiet. Aurora Grand had become a stage, and the real performance was just beginning. Elijah didn't wait for Clarissa's answer. He let his words hang in the air like a spark on velvet. "Are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" It wasn't just a question. It was a warning, or perhaps a test. Clarissa froze for a second, eyes widening before she smoothed her expression. She laughed, a hollow sound meant to disguise the flicker of unease. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her voice soft as silk, sharp as glass. Elijah didn't respond. He simply stared at her, not angry, not submissive, not pleading. It was the gaze of a man who had stood in 1,000 rooms like this, endured 1,000 stares like this, and no longer felt the need to justify his presence. The tension thickened. The smirks faded. Some guests exchanged glances, trying to piece together who this man really was. His words and his calm had shifted something. A young staffer near the desk, likely an intern, fidgeted. He looked between Clarissa and Elijah as if wanting to speak, but instead dropped his gaze, unwilling to step into this collision of power. In the corner, the young black couple still watched, the woman leaning close to whisper something to her partner. Elijah exhaled softly, placed a hand on his bag, and turned. He didn't rush like a man shamed out the door. He walked slowly measured steps, cataloging the room, Clarissa's painted face, the approving spectators, the thick, suffocating silence. Near the door, he stopped, turned back. His gaze swept across the lobby from Clarissa frozen behind her counter to the guests suddenly avoiding his eyes. "Remember this moment," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "Because I will." No one answered. The piano played on, its cold notes filling the silence, but no one was really listening anymore. They were watching Elijah as he pushed through the glass doors, leaving the Aurora Grand like a man who had just directed his own scene and ended it on his terms. Inside, Clarissa stood still, her professional smile gone, replaced by something unreadable. Guests whispered to one another. Someone asked softly, "Who was he?" But no one had an answer. One thing was certain, this man was no ordinary guest, and the story wasn't over. Clarissa stood ramrod straight behind the counter, lips pressed so tight they'd gone pale, as if Elijah's very presence was a stain she needed to scrub clean. She didn't bother hiding her contempt anymore. A single glance was enough to summon Peter Hale, the head of security, from his post in the far corner. Peter, a massive man with a buzz cut and a square, unyielding jaw, had the build and posture of someone who'd been a soldier long before he put on Aurora Grand's charcoal gray uniform. He stopped in front of Clarissa, standing at attention, waiting for orders. "Remove him," Clarissa said, her voice cold as marble. Then, for the benefit of the invisible audience she knew was watching, she added, "Maintain Aurora's standards." Those words, "maintain standards," rang out like a declaration of power. They weren't just for Peter. They were for every guest in the lobby. And everyone knew exactly what those standards meant and who didn't meet them. Peter nodded and started toward Elijah. He didn't move aggressively, but his deliberate, measured steps were enough to draw every eye in the room to the confrontation. Aurora Grand had become a stage. The guests who'd been pretending to busy themselves with champagne flutes or their phones now watched openly. Some subtly raised their devices, pretending to check messages while recording. A middle-aged man at the bar swiveled his chair around, arms crossed, ready to watch the show. In the corner, a young black couple, Malik and Jordan, clutched each other's hands. Malik, in a plain white shirt, stared at Elijah as though seeing himself reflected in that calm, unwavering stance. Jordan lowered her gaze, her eyes full of both fear and quiet solidarity. To them, this scene was painfully familiar public humiliation, wrapped in the language of standards and policy. Elijah didn't move. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his face as composed as if none of this concerned him. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. Peter's looming frame cast a long shadow over him as he closed in, but Elijah stood his ground, unmoved. Clarissa adjusted her posture, smoothing the collar of her tailored jacket like an actress ready for her close-up. She knew every eye in the room was on her, and she basked in it. "This is Aurora Grand," she announced, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We have standards to uphold." Her words weren't just a defense of the hotel's image. They were a reminder to everyone present, some people belonged here, and some didn't. Tonight, Clarissa had decided Elijah fell on the wrong side of that line. The Aurora Grand had become her theater, and without a script, Clarissa commanded the stage. Peter stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the gleaming marble floor. He closed in on Elijah, his hand gesturing a motion perfected by years of removing unwanted guests, a silent command to leave the building. Elijah glanced briefly at the outstretched hand, then lifted his gaze. His eyes swept the room from the onlookers staring in silence to Clarissa, frozen behind her counter. He didn't react, didn't argue. He simply nodded a calm, measured nod, as though he, not Clarissa, were in control of this scene. Elijah gripped the handle of his bag and let Peter lead the way, following at his own pace. The soft roll of his suitcase across the marble floor was the only sound, a strange, mournful rhythm against the tense silence, Guests shifted to clear a path, their eyes fixed on him. A few whispered. Most stayed silent but complicit. Clarissa didn't miss her moment. As Elijah and Peter reached the center of the lobby, she raised her voice, letting it carry. This is why standards matter. Her words were calculated loud enough for all to hear, a justification for her actions, but also a performance and assertion of her power in this space. It wasn't just about Elijah, it was about solidifying her authority before the watchful eyes of the lobby. An older man nodded approvingly, his face lit with smug agreement. A younger woman raised her phone to capture the scene, only to drop it quickly when Clarissa's gaze flicked her way. Smiles, small, tight-lipped, appeared among some guests. They weren't smiling out of joy. They were smiling out of the safety of aligning themselves with power. In the corner, Malik tightened his grip on Jordan's hand. He leaned in, whispering, "This is all too familiar." Jordan just nodded. Her eyes brimmed with quiet pain. They'd seen this too many times, a black man turned into a living example of what happens when you cross the invisible line of luxury spaces. Elijah said nothing. He walked slowly, each step deliberate. This wasn't the walk of a defeated man. It was the walk of someone cataloging everything, every face, every word, every smirk in this room. Clarissa watched him go, feeling the weight of the guests' approving stares. In that moment, she felt righteous, powerful, vindicated. But Peter saw something else. He felt it in Elijah's stillness, a kind of unsettling calm. This wasn't submission. This was a man who knew he'd be back, and when he returned, everything would be different. The Aurora Grand was a theater, and everyone present that night was a performer, even if they didn't yet realize the real play hadn't started. Peter opened the massive glass doors, letting the night air sweep through the lobby. Elijah stopped at the threshold. He didn't step out. Not yet. He turned, his back to the street, facing the entire lobby. A heavy silence fell. It wasn't embarrassment. It was anticipation, waiting to see what the ejected guest would do next. Elijah let the silence stretch, forcing every onlooker to sit in their discomfort. Then he spoke. Slowly. Clearly. "Remember this moment, because I will." No more words. Just that, hanging in the air like a spark in a room full of gasoline. A few guests frowned, confused. Others dropped their eyes to their phones, pretending not to have heard. But they had. They all had, and they all felt the weight of it. Peter looked at Elijah, a chill running through him. He'd escorted countless guests out before, angry, pleading, even begging, but none had spoken like this. None had carried themselves with such unnerving composure. For the first time, Peter wondered who, exactly, he was dealing with. At the bar, a woman in a sapphire blue gown whispered to her companion, "Who is he?" Her friend shrugged, but his eyes stayed locked on Elijah. In the corner, Malik murmured to Jordan, "He's not scared. You see that he's not scared." Jordan nodded, though her eyes carried something different, a flicker of hope, the fragile kind born from watching someone refuse to break. Elijah adjusted his grip on the suitcase handle. Smoothly, decisively, he walked out. The glass doors closed behind him with a quiet thud, a punctuation mark to the performance Clarissa thought she had directed. But everyone who'd witnessed it knew the story wasn't over. Inside, Clarissa drew a deep breath, regaining her composure. She signaled for her staff to return to their posts, yet several pairs of eyes still darted toward the doors, toward the place where Elijah had stood. The Aurora Grand sank back into its routine of soft piano music and expensive perfume, but the atmosphere had shifted. Outside, Elijah walked into the night not like a man ejected from a place where he didn't belong, but like a man preparing to return and change everything. And his words still echoed in the minds of everyone who'd heard them. Remember this moment, because I will. Elijah stood beneath the dull yellow glow of a street lamp, just outside Aurora Grand, the same doors that had spat him out like he didn't belong. The city roared on honking taxis, laughter spilling from a rooftop restaurant across the street, the hum of a nightlife that didn't care who got humiliated tonight. But right where Elijah stood, silence. His suitcase sat by his side. He tilted his head back, staring up at the tower of glass and gold, the picture-perfect fortress of standards. Every glowing window was a reminder. This is for people like us, not for people like you. Elijah didn't look at it like a guest who'd been turned away. He looked at it like a man studying prey. And then the past hit him. He saw himself as a kid racing barefoot through the narrow back streets of a poor portside neighborhood. He smelled the cheap detergent on the single school uniform his Haitian mother washed by hand every night. He heard her voice, steady and unbreakable. There will be places, Elijah, where they won't open the door for you. Not because you don't deserve it, but because they can't imagine you belong there. He remembered his small hands grabbing hers. So what do I do? Mama? Her answer had stayed with him forever. If they won't open the door for you, buy the whole building. That was the seed. Tonight, it bloomed. Elijah breathed in, let the anger burn itself out, and when his eyes opened again, they weren't the eyes of a humiliated man. They were the eyes of a hunter. He grabbed his phone. The screen lit his face calm, sharp, already 5 steps ahead. He scrolled, stopped at a name, Aisha, tap. 2 rings. Mr. Monroe, came her voice quick, nervous. I saw the report. He cut her off, his tone ice-cold steel. Aisha, activate the ownership notice. Assemble the full executive team in 20 minutes. I want everyone in that room. A beat of silence. Then, understood, sir. Call ended. Elijah didn't move for a moment. He let the city noise blur into nothing. Replay after replay of Clarissa's words, the smirks, the quiet chuckles, all locked in his mind like evidence in a trial. Aurora Grand wasn't just a hotel. It was a machine. And Clarissa. Just one more cog keeping it running exactly as intended. He looked back up at the glowing tower. 3 days ago, Monroe Hospitality closed on the full acquisition of the Aurora Grand chain. 3 days. And tonight, their face of the brand just publicly threw its new owner onto the curb like a vagrant. This wasn't just an insult. This was the reason Elijah had bought Aurora in the first place. He thought back to that boardroom meeting a week ago. His words had been clear. We aren't buying chandeliers and silk sheets. We're buying the chance to rebuild an industry that treats some people like they don't belong. Some had doubted him. Clarissa Bell just proved him right. His phone buzzed. Aisha, again. Ownership notice is live. Press and staff have been notified. Scheduling your meeting now. Elijah typed one line back. Good. Send me everything on Clarissa. Complaints, reviews. All of it. He pocketed the phone, stared up one last time at that golden tower like an architect studying a flawed design. This wasn't their fortress anymore. It was his. And tomorrow he'd start tearing down every invisible wall they'd built. Elijah gripped the handle of his suitcase, the way a soldier grips his weapon. Aurora Grand didn't just get a new owner. It got a new definition of power. He exhaled, a razor-thin smirk breaking across his face. Not joy, not satisfaction. Resolve. Game on, he whispered. He rolled his suitcase toward the black car pulling up at the curb. Elijah Monroe wasn't leaving like a man defeated. He was leaving like a man preparing his return. And when he came back, Aurora Grand and everyone inside would never forget the name Elijah Monroe again. 20 minutes. That's how long it had been since Elijah Monroe walked out of Aurora Grand humiliated, dismissed like a man who didn't belong. But inside, the marble palace of chandeliers and polite piano music had turned into a hive on fire. The first whispers came through staff group chats. Aurora Grand officially acquired by Monroe Hospitality. Receptionists glanced at their phones, trying to hide shaking hands under polished composure. A junior manager leaned in toward a colleague, voice trembling. "Did you see Monroe Hospitality just sent the official notice? We've got a new owner." A housekeeper froze in the hallway, balancing an empty tray against the wall just to eavesdrop. Guests caught on, too. On the velvet couches near the window, people scrolled frantically. Headlines were already popping up. Monroe Hospitality completes full takeover of Aurora Grand. A middle-aged man whispered to his wife, "You know Monroe, right? One of the fastest-growing hotel empires." She turned to the front desk, eyes flickering between curiosity and fear. But there was one person who still had no idea what was coming. Clarissa Bell. She stood proudly behind the front desk, straight-backed like a general basking in her own victory. To two VIP guests lounging nearby, she recounted her triumph with a voice dripping sugar but loud enough for the whole room to hear. "He walked in here like he owned the place. No reservation, no proper attire. I had to have security escort him out. We simply can't compromise the Aurora standard. Can we?" The guests nodded approvingly. One, a silver-haired businessman, even raised his wine glass in her honor. "You did the right thing. Places like this need clear boundaries." Clarissa smiled. Her eyes gleamed with pride. She thought she'd tightened her grip on power. She didn't know her words were being silently recorded in the minds of every staff member nearby, staff who had already read the internal memo, staff who knew Aurora wasn't hers anymore. At the bar, a young server leaned to a coworker and whispered, "She doesn't even know who she just threw out." The coworker smirked, muttering back, "Give it a minute. She'll find out." The lobby, where only half an hour ago Clarissa staged her public humiliation of a man she thought was beneath her, now felt like the quiet before a storm. And that storm had a name. Elijah Monroe. The glass doors of Aurora Grand swung open. The piano kept playing, but everything else, the conversations, the laughter, stopped dead when Elijah walked back in. He wasn't under the street lamp anymore. He wasn't the silent guest security had dragged out. He came back like a man walking into his own house. Because he was. Whispers spread like shockwaves. "That's him. He's back." Receptionists fumbled their paperwork. Guests straightened in their seats. They'd all seen the memo. And now the memo had a face. Clarissa looked up, eyebrows twitching at the sight of him. For half a second, she stepped back, but her mask of authority snapped back into place. She forced a thin smile. "You came back. I thought I made myself clear." Her voice tried to stay sweet, but it wavered. Elijah didn't answer. He walked slow, deliberate across the marble, every step echoing like a countdown. At the desk, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and slid it across the counter. Elijah Monroe. His tone was calm, but it cut like a blade. Then he leaned in, locked eyes with her. "The new owner of this hotel, and we're not done." Silence. A silence that seemed to stretch forever. Guests turned their heads. Phones slipped into pockets. The silver-haired businessman who toasted Clarissa earlier set his glass down, his face drained of color. Clarissa stared at the card like it might burst into flames. Her voice cracked. "You? What?" Behind the desk, a junior staffer, Hero, frantically typed into his terminal. His eyes scanned the screen. Seconds later, he spoke up, his voice shaking. "Ma'am, it's true. The memo went out. He is the new owner of Aurora Grand." The words hit like a thunderclap. Clarissa froze. Guests who had chuckled at Elijah's audacity now avoided his gaze. A woman in a green dress stood abruptly, muttering an excuse before rushing out. Elijah didn't look at Clarissa anymore. He turned to the lobby, scanned every face, the ones who'd watched him get humiliated and said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice steady, filling the room. "Good. Now everyone knows who I am." He paused, let the weight settle. "And trust me, this is only the beginning." No one dared breathe. Aurora Grand, Clarissa's fortress, now belonged to the man she had thrown out like trash. And everyone in the room knew they had just watched the ground shift beneath their feet. Elijah plucked his card off the counter, slipped it back into his pocket, then turned away. No more words. He didn't need them. As he walked toward the grand staircase, no one stopped him. No one even dared move. Only when he disappeared upstairs did the lobby explode into whispers. Phones out, staff rushing messages, guests buzzing with the story they'd just witnessed. One young employee whispered to herself, voice shaking, "Everything's about to change." And she was right. Aurora Grand wasn't Clarissa Bell's stage anymore. It was Elijah Monroe's, and the real show had just begun. Elijah stood at the very center of the Aurora Grand lobby, the same spot where, less than an hour ago, he had been escorted out like an uninvited nobody. But this time, he wasn't silent. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a familiar number. Then, without hesitation, he put it on speaker. The ringing echoed through the marble hall, an ordinary sound that suddenly felt like a countdown. 3 rings. Then a voice answered. "We're in session with the Monroe Hospitality Board. Mr. Monroe, we're ready for your report." Elijah didn't take his eyes off Clarissa when he spoke. "Good. I want you all to hear this clearly." His voice was even, deliberate, and loud enough for the entire lobby to catch every word. He lowered the phone slightly, still staring at Clarissa, though his words were meant for the board. "Your manager just threw me the new owner out of this hotel, because I didn't meet her standards." Every word cut like a scalpel, slicing through the illusion of power Clarissa had wrapped herself in. The room froze. Guests covered their mouths in disbelief. On the other end, another voice broke in deeper, sharper. "To confirm, you're referring to manager Clarissa Bell." Elijah nodded once, still holding Clarissa in his gaze. "Correct. She didn't just violate basic hospitality principles, she humiliated me, in front of witnesses, and not just as a guest but as the new owner of this entire chain." It felt like the air itself had stopped moving. A woman at the bar leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He's turning the lobby into a courtroom." Her friend nodded, eyes locked on Elijah. Clarissa tried to regain her footing, forcing her voice steady. You can't turn a misunderstanding into a public accusation like this." She scanned the room for allies, but the guests who had been toasting her earlier now avoided her eyes, suddenly too busy with their wine glasses or their phones. Elijah ignored her. "Board, log everything," he said into the phone, "and we will address it immediately. This isn't just about one hotel. This is about the culture we've acquired and what we're going to change." His voice wasn't just an accusation, it was a declaration. Clarissa stood frozen, gripping the marble edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Elijah let the silence stretch, until even the bystanders began to squirm. Then, He stepped closer to the desk, his voice low but thundering through the stillness. "What brand are you protecting? One that excludes people like me?" The question wasn't just for her, it was for everyone in the room. No one moved. A man in a gray suit slowly folded his newspaper, his cold eyes fixed on Clarissa. Behind the desk, young Hero lowered his gaze, heart pounding like a drum. He knew he was witnessing something rare, power stripped bare in front of everyone. Clarissa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Elijah didn't let her off the hook. He leaned in, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You call this protecting a brand?" He swept his hand toward the lobby. "This a place where a black man in simple clothes isn't treated as a guest but as a threat." A sharp inhale came from the far corner. Malik, the young black man sitting with his girlfriend Jordan, squeezed her hand. "He's speaking for all of us," he whispered. Jordan nodded, eyes glistening like she was seeing something she hadn't seen in a long time, someone refusing to stay silent. Elijah's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on every face, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones now ashamed. "You call that a standard?" He didn't wait for an answer. Clarissa stared at the floor, trembling. Her armor, pride, authority, control had shattered, piece by piece, right there in front of everyone. Elijah hadn't just asked a question. He'd delivered a verdict. Then, deliberately, he pulled out a second phone and placed it on the counter. His voice was calm, but it sliced through the tension like a knife. "Let me make this clear. What just happened here wasn't only witnessed by the people in this lobby." He tapped the screen. A small beep sounded. A green light blinked. Elijah raised his head, looking first at Clarissa, then at everyone else. "The lobby cameras are live streaming. The entire company is watching, and this footage is already on its way to the press." Gasps. A ripple of panic moved through the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the lounge bolted for the exit. Behind the desk, Hero sucked in a breath like he'd just been freed from a secret he'd been forced to keep. Clarissa went pale, her lips trembling. You can't." But she couldn't finish the sentence. Elijah didn't care. He turned the phone toward himself so the camera caught his face calm, unflinching. "I want everyone from the boardroom to every hotel in our chain to see this, and so will the public." He left the desk without another glance, walking toward the center of the lobby. Each step echoed, shrinking the room around him. By the door, a young woman whipped out her phone. Within seconds, social media was lighting up. Aurora Grand scandal, new owner kicked out by hotel manager. Malik turned to Jordan, his voice low but electric. "You see that now everyone's going to know." Jordan nodded, a fragile but undeniable spark of hope in her eyes. Elijah stopped at the door, looked back one last time. "Light is the only cure for places like this," he said, voice carrying to every corner. "And I just opened the door." Then he left. But outside, the storm was already raging. Aurora Grand would never be the same. News traveled faster than anyone inside Aurora Grand could have imagined. Less than an hour after Elijah Monroe dropped the truth bomb in that lobby, social media exploded. Clips from the lobby cameras and guest phones were everywhere. Headlines screamed. Elijah Monroe, new owner of Aurora Hotels, thrown out by his own manager for not meeting standards. Within hours, hashtags like Aurora Justice and Dignity First were trending worldwide. Thousands of comments flooded in. "This is why we need transparency in hospitality." Disgusting, but sadly, not surprising. "Elijah Monroe, you did the right thing." His words. "This lobby camera is live streaming to corporate. and the press became a rallying cry, shared tens of thousands of times. Phones at Monroe Hospitality wouldn't stop ringing. Aisha, Elijah's razor-sharp chief of staff, fielded non-stop calls from CNN, The New York Times, and Business Weekly. Everyone wanted interviews, exclusives, the full story from Elijah himself. Even the civil rights lawyers were calling. One well-known attorney left a message. "Mr. Monroe, if you're willing to take this public, we'll represent you pro bono." Nonprofits advocating for racial equity began posting statements of support. And then came the floodgates. Former guests started speaking out. A woman tweeted about being denied a room because her outfit didn't meet Aurora's standards. A black family shared how they'd been refused service at one of the chain's restaurants. One story became 10, then 100, then thousands. Suddenly, Clarissa Bell's so-called standards were being exposed for what they really were, a culture of exclusion. Meanwhile, inside Aurora Grand, chaos. Employees received internal memos demanding confidentiality, but it was too late. Social media had already taken over. Some younger staffers anonymously told reporters, "We're not surprised this happened, just surprised it finally went public." And Elijah, silent. No tweets, no statements, no interviews. Because Elijah Monroe wasn't avoiding the storm. He was preparing for it. Inside a small boardroom on the 12th floor of Aurora Grand, the real reckoning began. The air was so tense you could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. Elijah stood at the head of the table, a simple shirt, no tie, but his posture unshakable. Around him, key members of Monroe Hospitality and Aurora's new executive team, silent and waiting. Elijah's eyes moved from face to face. Then his voice cut through the room. "We start at the root. Clarissa Bell, terminated, effective immediately." A few exchanged glances. Someone started to speak, then thought better of it when Elijah's fingers tapped the polished wood in quiet warning. Aisha, always precise, typed a quick message and said simply, "Done." Elijah continued without pause. "I want every buried complaint brought to the surface, every email, every internal report, no more cover-ups." He leaned forward. "Start now. I want a full report on my desk before the day ends." A former Aurora exec, clearly terrified, stood and stammered. "Sir, some of those records were already handled internally. They're no longer relevant." Elijah's gaze locked on him, cold and surgical. "Handled, you mean silenced, protected the violators. If those records ever existed, they're still relevant. Bring them out." Hours later, the truth was on the table. Aisha read aloud, her usually steady voice trembling. 19 formal complaints, all tied to racial bias or exclusionary conduct by Clarissa Bell. Most were handled internally. Several guests severed contracts. Multiple staff resigned. 19. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. A culture. Elijah crossed his arms, staring at the files like they were evidence in a trial. Silence. He let it hang, forcing everyone to sit with the weight of those 19 ignored voices. Then, quietly but firmly, "This is why we're here. Not to put gold leaf on rotting walls, but to tear them down and rebuild from the ground up." No one disagreed, because everyone knew the storm had only just begun. The door opened. Clarissa Bell walked in. The immaculate manager of Aurora Grand was gone. Her cream-colored designer suit looked crumpled. Her perfectly pinned hair was now falling apart, just like her power. No one offered her a seat. No one spoke. She walked to the far end of the table, fingers clasped tightly like a drowning woman clinging to wreckage. Elijah stayed at the head of the table, watching, silent. That silence was louder than any words. "Mr. Monroe," Clarissa's voice cracked, I don't excuse what happened, but I have one request." She swallowed hard, staring at the floor. "Let me leave quietly. No press, no public humiliation. I just want to disappear." A whisper rippled through the room. Some former Aurora managers looked away, pity shame, no one could tell. Aisha stopped writing, looking to Elijah. Elijah moved. Slow, deliberate steps. The sound of his shoes on the hardwood echoed like a countdown. He stopped directly in front of her. Quietly, his voice was low, controlled, deadly. He tilted his head, considering her. "Silence is a privilege, and you stripped me of it last night when you turned me into public sport in my own hotel." Clarissa's lips parted. Nothing came out. Elijah leaned in slightly. "You want to leave quietly? No. You'll leave the right way, and everyone will know exactly why you're gone, and what you buried here." He turned to the board. "Prepare a press release, transparent, direct. Make sure the public knows what we're changing and why." Aisha nodded, jotting it down. One board member muttered, "This will shake the industry." Elijah didn't flinch. "Good. Every system shakes before it collapses." Clarissa stood there, hollow-eyed, knowing her plea had died the second she walked into that room. No one looked at her as she turned and walked out, her expensive heels dragging against the floor like a slow funeral march. Elijah stared at the thick stack of complaints on the table, 19 voices buried under silence. Then he said softly, almost to himself, "An era ends here." His eyes lifted, sharper than ever. "And a new one begins." And everyone in that room understood. The real reform had just begun. 1 month later, the gilded walls of Aurora Grand weren't just luxury decor anymore. They'd become a national symbol. The night Elijah Monroe was humiliated, and how he turned that humiliation into a lever for change, was now on the covers of major magazines. Business Weekly called it the defining moment for hospitality reform. The New York Times ran an op-ed, "When a guest becomes the game changer." Aurora Grand wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a case study dissected in classrooms at Harvard, Wharton, and beyond. Professors broke down Elijah's every move, choosing to be humiliated, broadcasting the evidence, turning a crisis into an industry-wide reckoning. Students took notes as if they were studying a masterclass in strategy, but this one had something business schools rarely touched: justice. In a massive auditorium in New York, hundreds gathered: corporate executives, academics, social advocates, all waiting to hear Elijah speak. He walked to the podium. No designer suit, just a crisp white shirt, dark slacks. But his presence filled the room. Behind him, a massive screen glowed. Dignity, first initiative. Elijah set both hands on the wooden podium, scanning the crowd before he spoke. Hospitality must begin with dignity, not with skin color, not with wallets, wardrobes, or the so-called standards used as excuses for exclusion. He paused, letting the words sink deep. If a place cannot welcome people as people, it's not hospitality, it's a fortress of prejudice. The audience erupted in applause. But Elijah wasn't here for applause. He was here to start a movement. "We've begun a full review of Aurora's processes," he continued. "No more burying discrimination complaints. Every report will be documented, investigated, and made public. We've opened a confidential hotline for guests and employees to report bias with zero retaliation. And this is just the beginning. His gaze swept across the room, a sea of faces representing every corner of the service industry. I challenge all of you here today, stop hiding behind standards to justify exclusion. If our industry wants to survive the 21st century, it must be rebuilt on the foundation of dignity. The room rose to its feet. Thunderous applause. But for Elijah, this wasn't the finish line. It was just the first brick in a much larger rebuild. Behind the scenes, real reform was already underway. Aurora Grand and the entire chain had undergone changes no one would have thought possible a month ago. And at the heart of that change, people, Jake Morrison, the security guard who escorted Elijah out that night, now stood in a new office on Aurora's 5th floor. The nameplate on the door read, Regional Director of Security. 1 month ago, Jake thought he'd be fired. Instead, Elijah chose a different path: reform over removal. You did what you thought your role required, Elijah told Jake privately, but it's the role itself that needs redefining. Jake attended a 3-week intensive training on risk management and, most importantly, bias awareness. He came back not just with new skills, but a new mission. Under his leadership, Aurora's security teams now protect not just property, but people's dignity. Jake still remembers the day Elijah slid the new contract across the table. You're not just staying, Jake. You're leading the change. For the first time in years, Jake felt like his work actually mattered. And it wasn't just Jake. Malik and Jordan, the young couple who quietly witnessed Elijah's humiliation that night, were now part of the mission too. After the story went viral, Elijah personally reached out. I saw you that night, he told them over coffee. I know that feeling wasn't new to you. Let's turn that pain into power. Weeks later, Malik and Jordan became ambassadors for the Dignity and Hospitality Project, Elijah's new initiative to connect people who'd been excluded by the service industry and give them a seat at the table for reform. They hit the road, speaking at universities, sharing their stories with corporate boards, challenging the next generation of hospitality leaders. Malik, a young engineer, used his skills to build an online platform where people could report discrimination. Jordan, a former hospitality worker, stood on stages, recounting the countless times she'd been dismissed for her skin or her style. We're not just reliving our pain, Jordan told a packed seminar. We're rewriting how this industry sees people like us. Elijah listened, took their ideas, turned them into policy. Aurora Grand was no longer a fortress of exclusionary standards. It was becoming a beacon of dignity. Back at the New York summit, the crowd quieted as Elijah returned to the podium this time, not to talk about the past, but to unveil what came next. He placed both hands on the lectern. Rows of journalists, corporate heads, activists, and former victims of exclusion watched in silence. What happened at Aurora Grand wasn't an isolated incident, Elijah began, his voice steady but hard. It was the tip of a system built on silence and fear, and we can't reform a system by patching cracks in the surface. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. Then, that's why today I'm announcing what we call dignity audits. The massive screen behind him lit up. Dignity audits, redefining accountability in hospitality. We will conduct anonymous audits across hotels, restaurants, and luxury services. Trained teams will pose as guests, employees, or partners and document how they're treated. The results public. If you do well, you'll be certified dignity compliant. If you fail, the world will know. Whispers swept through the room. Some corporate reps exchanged nervous looks. They knew exactly what this meant. No more sweeping things under internal processes. Elijah didn't let the tension breathe for long. This isn't revenge. This is transparency, and transparency is the only path to real change. He locked eyes with the cameras streaming live to millions. If our industry wants to survive, it must be rebuilt on dignity, and if we can't do that, we don't deserve to survive. His words hit social media like wildfire. Hashtag Dignity First and hashtag Dignity Audits shot up the trending charts. News outlets updated their headlines. Elijah Monroe announces industry-wide dignity audits. Hospitality faces historic reckoning. Elijah's voice softened for his closing. This is the beginning of a new era, one where anyone walking into a hotel, a restaurant, any service space is greeted first and foremost as a human being. The room rose as one. Standing ovation. But Elijah knew this wasn't the ending. It was the opening act of a fight that would change the entire industry. He nodded once, stepped away from the podium, and walked straight into the next chapter. 2 years later, Aurora Grand no longer carried the sting of judgmental stares or standards used as weapons. The crystal chandeliers still glittered, the marble floors still gleamed, but the atmosphere entirely transformed. It no longer felt like a fortress built for the few, it felt like a home that welcomed everyone. Step inside, and the difference was impossible to miss. The front desk staff no longer wore the cold, distant faces of gatekeepers. They smiled with warmth that reached their eyes. The guests in the lobby weren't a uniform class anymore. There were executives in tailored suits, a multi-generational family taking photos by the grand piano, a pair of backpacking travelers lounging comfortably in the seating area, a newlywed couple admiring a large painting in the corridor. No one felt out of place. No one felt like an intruder. New signs lined the walls. Dignity first. Near the front desk, a digital display streamed live dignity audit reports, guest reviews, service evaluation results, and public responses to complaints. Transparency, out in the open. And there, at the very center of it all, stood Elijah Monroe, the very spot where, 2 years ago, he'd been escorted out like someone who didn't belong. Now, in a simple navy suit, no entourage, no pomp. He stood quietly, scanning the space, not like a man who owned it, but like a man making sure the change he fought for had truly taken root. Memories resurfaced. Clarissa Bell's disdainful glare, the soft, cruel laughter of the guests that night, the humiliation of being marched out through these very doors. But now, those memories didn't weigh him down. They felt like a marker, the beginning of a journey that brought this place and himself here. A young staff member approached, bowing slightly. "Welcome back to Aurora Grand, Mr. Monroe." No forced politeness, just genuine pride. Elijah nodded, smiled faintly. He walked to the front desk, placed his hand on the marble countertop. 2 years ago, this was where judgment had been passed on him. Now, it was where every guest was received with respect. He took a deep breath. The familiar scent of sandalwood was now laced with soft citrus, a small but intentional change in his redesign to make the space feel warmer, more inviting. Elijah turned, taking in the scene. Guests chatting, staff moving with purpose, a living picture of harmony where exclusion once reigned. Aurora Grand hadn't just changed, it had been redeemed. He walked toward the right-hand wall, where a new bronze plaque gleamed under the crystal lights. He stopped, reading the inscription like a personal vow. "In memory of dignity denied, may this place forever stand for justice." Elijah touched the plaque lightly. The metal was cold, but from his palm radiated a quiet warmth born of painful memories, and the long, hard road to this moment. Footsteps behind him. Jake Morrison. Once the guard who'd escorted Elijah out, Now, dressed in his regional security director suit, he stood beside Elijah, also gazing at the plaque. "Every time I read this," Jake said quietly, "I feel the weight of my responsibility. I was part of the problem, but now, at least I can help protect what we're building." Elijah nodded. "You turned remorse into action. That's what matters." Across the lobby, Malik and Jordan, once silent witnesses to Elijah's humiliation, now spoke with a group of young trainees from Aurora's new inclusion program. Jordan spotted Elijah and waved. Malik approached, beaming. "Mr. Monroe, we just wrapped up our dignity and hospitality orientation with the interns. They believe they can help reshape this industry." Elijah looked at them, seeing a reflection of his younger self in their eyes. "You've done more than I imagined. 2 years ago, I just hoped you'd reclaim your own voices, but now you're helping hundreds find theirs." Jordan smiled softly. "We're just walking the path you opened." Elijah glanced back at the plaque. The words weren't just an inscription anymore. They were a living promise to himself, to those standing here now, and to every soul who would walk through these doors in the future. "Justice isn't a destination," he whispered, almost to himself. "It's the road we walk, every day." The lobby of Aurora Grand no longer felt like a hall of cold power. It was a monument to victory, not just Elijah's, but for everyone who'd ever been denied dignity, and now stepped inside, fully seen. Elijah stepped back, standing once more at the center of the lobby. Crystal light reflected off the marble tiles like a mirror beneath his feet. Everything had changed. The fearful, condescending faces were gone, replaced by genuine smiles, firm handshakes, and something rarer than luxury peace. He closed his eyes briefly, listening. The murmur of multilingual conversations, children laughing near the lounge, the steady click of staff shoes carrying dinner service to the banquet hall. Every sound a testament that Aurora Grand had become what it was always meant to be. Not a fortress. A bridge. A young staffer passed by, bowing with a bright smile. Elijah returned a slight nod. A simple exchange, but a powerful reminder. Change doesn't begin with speeches or boardroom decisions. It begins with these small moments, a receptionist meeting a guest's eyes and seeing a person, not a stereotype. Elijah walked to the entrance. Stopped exactly where, 2 years ago, he'd been escorted out like an unwanted guest. But this spot no longer felt like a scar. It was a marker proof that every victory begins with a moment that feels impossible to survive. He turned back one last time. The bronze plaque glinted under the lights, reflecting his face. Elijah smiled, not the smile of a victor, but of a man who'd found meaning in his journey. He drew in a long breath, sealing this image into memory, then stepped through the grand doors, leaving behind an Aurora Grand reborn. Elijah's voiceover carried as the scene lingered on the plaque. Dignity denied anywhere diminishes dignity everywhere, but when dignity is reclaimed, it can transform the world. The camera held on the words, "In memory of dignity denied," then slowly faded to black. And the final sound, the hum of conversations and laughter, proof that this story isn't over, because there are still walls left to tear down, and still more halls waiting to be reclaimed. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.